Thank you. First of all, thank you to the Stockholm International Water Institute and to all of you who have joined today. Really nice to see you and to be with you. My name is Maura Barry, and I serve as USAID's Interim Global Water Coordinator. I also serve as USAID's Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. So I want to kick off this conversation today. And first of all, start off with some thoughts on the last 18 months and the impact that this has had on water and sanitation. I think we all remember that when the crisis started, many of us were training ourselves to sing that happy birthday song twice, right? To wash our hands. But you know, the sad truth is that there were 3 billion people that were lacking water and soap at home to be able to wash their hands. That still remains the case. And so I think that all of us here participating in this event would agree that the COVID pandemic has challenged water security in unique ways. And I'd really like to take this moment to recognize that when the pandemic first hit, service providers, such as those working in water and sanitation, really had to overcome enormous challenges to meet just basic needs. And so I want to ask all of you on the call that you join me in recognizing and appreciating their work under very difficult circumstances. Given the critical role that water, sanitation, and hygiene play in slowing the spread of disease and preparing economies to reopen safely, I think the global community really expected extraordinary things from those service providers. And you know, it's also important to recognize the operational challenges that many utilities faced. According to some data, bill collection rates dropped by as much as 40%, all while utilities faced increasing costs of personal protective equipment and tried to rapidly deploy new infrastructure like hand washing facilities. And in addition to the direct impacts of the pandemic, we all know that water security is increasingly under the threat from a warming planet. 90% of climate change impacts are water related. That of course includes floods, droughts, increasing water pollution. Water instability is also exacerbating disease, conflict, and migration. So while the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the largest global shocks in the wash sector, I think we can expect more of these once in a generation shocks. And so these challenges require a new level of resilience. So let me give you a few examples. In countries like Nigeria and the Philippines, we helped service providers deploy new contact-free mobile payment technologies that kept revenue flowing and it kept staff safe. In Burkina Faso, we worked with our partners to broadcast radio messages to promote hand washing with soap. And in Indonesia, USAID supported the installation of thousands of hand washing stations in vulnerable communities. And while USAID joined other donors in providing emergency subsidies to keep water and sanitation service providers solvent, there's absolutely no question that we need more investment to increase resilience and avoid these difficult situations in the future. The pandemic highlighted many structural weaknesses in our WASH programs, but at the same time, it also highlighted opportunities to strengthen resilience and to improve our collective development efforts. For example, our surveys in 5 African countries last summer showed that hours of water service had been cut for nearly 40% of the respondents. And these cuts are often essential to keep staff working and pumps to keep operating, but certainly they present a large challenge. And another long-term challenge we see is investment. While the pandemic still threatens many countries and regions, maintenance, unfortunately, has been put on hold, and that's depriving areas of new critical infrastructure. So today, the idea is to step back and capture the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and explore how those lessons can help us build resilience for a future filled with more, we know it's going to be filled with more frequent shocks and stresses. So we have assembled a really exciting panel of experts today that's going to help us do just that. And to get the discussion started, I'm really pleased to introduce Vanessa Gunter. She's a colleague from USAID's WASH Partnership and Learning, or what we refer to as WASH Pals, and she's going to get the panel started. So again, thank you for joining and your participation. I look forward to the great discussion, and Vanessa, I hand it over to you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thank you to the session organizers for the opportunity to share our work today, and a warm welcome to the audience. I'd like to start off with a quote from Canadian author and activist Naomi Klein. In a recent interview with The Guardian, she states, "There's always this discourse whenever disasters hit. Climate change doesn't discriminate. The pandemic doesn't discriminate. We're all in this together." But that is not true, she says. That is not how disasters act. They act as magnifiers and they act as intensifiers. This presentation focuses on some of these magnifiers and intensifiers, showcasing the impacts that the pandemic has on WASH services and the parallels that come along with climate-driven extreme events. Last year, USAID asked WASH Pals to analyze the effects of COVID-19 on WASH access and service delivery and products across its priority countries. The goal was to assist decision makers in an informed response to WASH-related impacts of the pandemic. Much of the work was focused on deep dives in 7 countries, and you can see them highlighted on the map on the right. WASH Pals interviewed key informants, among them service providers, government officials, the private sector, and donors, as well as conducted household surveys via SMS in deep dive countries except Nepal. We are following this work up with a longitudinal data collection study to monitor the longer term impacts. And you can find all of our reports under globalwaters/washpals.org. And that link can be shared as well. The slides that follow are based on our 2020 work, and please join me on the next slide. This slide highlights our top line findings in relation to water supply, sanitation, and the policy response. Through the first 4 to 6 months of the pandemic, though the economic shock was severe, widespread water supply disruptions were generally avoided. However, service providers have been financially and operationally stressed. When talking directly to households, our surveys reported access challenges related to COVID-19. As an example, between 1.4% and 6.4% of the respondents reported their water services declining below the GMP basic level, with the largest effects in Kenya. Reported difficulties by consumer on the sanitation side were lower than those for water supply. However, suppliers of sanitation products and services did report losses from reduced demand and higher operating expenses. To mitigate this, governments imposed free water directives in many countries, and in some, these directives were offered to customers regardless of income level and urban versus rural status. While motivated by supplying basic human needs, the result was widespread revenue losses, which have proven difficult to mitigate, especially since the service provider landscape is fragmented, particularly in peri-urban and rural Africa. So overall, the most consistent finding of our work was the financial stress being suffered by water service providers at both large and small scales, for reasons we'll walk through in the next slide. This slide conveys the cascade of effects that the pandemic shock caused, eventually impairing water service delivery and diminishing access to households. You can see the pandemic's immediate consequences with respect to WASH listed on the top of the bars. They include restrictions on movement, the free water directives, and disrupted supply chains. If we follow restrictions on movement located on the left, this leads to disrupted economic activity, which reduces earnings and depletes assets, which makes spending even on basic needs, such as water bills, more difficult. In addition, service providers were instructed to suspend fee collections from domestic customers, saw a deviation of resources towards healthcare, and experienced revenue declines from dramatic reductions on commercial and industrial water use, which compounded it in financial hardships. Finally, supplier operations became much more challenging in the face of disruptions for chemicals, fuels, and hardware, as well as hurdles from emergency response measures like temporary public water points. All these effects lead to impaired wash access to households. Next slide, please. With the world still struggling with the pandemic, reports of devastating floods, wildfires, and heat waves have come fast, serving as a painful reminder of another crisis that has still barely been adequately addressed. An unmistakable lesson from COVID-19 is that wash systems are fragile, and their fragility is laid bare by shocks. Extreme effects associated with climate change are similar to what we lay out for the pandemic, as we tried to depict in the slide. Climate shocks can also result in restrictions on movement, with associated effects on household incomes, and diversions of resources outside of WASH affect service provider revenues. Disruption on local supply chains, changing migration patterns, damaged infrastructure, as well as stressed water resources during drought periods strain operations. So the impacts of climate change slightly shift, but we still see reduced household spending, reduced service provider revenues, and stressed service provider operations, which compound in less WASH access. Dear audience, shocks to the WASH sector, whether due to COVID-19 or the ongoing climate crisis, present themselves as mirrored images, giving us the unique opportunity to learn lessons from either. Unfortunately, as we are witnessing now, these crises often occur simultaneously, exacerbating the severity of the issue and hindering response effort. This makes the research we prepared even more important and serves as yet another dire reminder to work quickly, united, and with a sense of resilience. To follow these values, we're really fortunate to have distinguished practitioners and policymakers on the panel that follows to explore specific measures to address these challenges. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to hand the mic back over.
Thank you very much for those videos. I welcome you everyone today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Isabel Alvarez, and I am a program officer of the Water and Sanitation Department at the Stockholm International Water Institute. Over the past year, CWE has collaborated with UNICEF to better understand the policy responses to COVID-19 in more than 80 countries. Through our work, we have found that governments around the world responded swiftly to the pandemic and the urgent WASH-related impacts. To learn more about these COVID-19 responses, we will turn first to UNICEF WASH specialist Jorge Alvarez Sala. Jorge, what types of COVID-19 policies did you find to be the most common?
Thank you, Isabel. Well, first of all, let's not forget that we are still in the middle of the pandemic. And it seems that it will take some time before everyone, everywhere, will go back to certain normality in the post-COVID era. Although countries contribute to establish new policies and adapt to the evolving context, it seems that most of the measures put in place by governments, regulators, service providers were introduced at the beginning of the pandemic. UNICEF, together with CWE, conducted a mapping exercise in 84 countries during the first half of 2020, which identified a number of measures which we classify in 5 groups or targets. The first one is intensify awareness raising campaigns for hand washing with soap and efficient water use at household level. The second one is strengthening infection prevention control at household and in institutions. The third one, preserving the ability of all people, including the most vulnerable, to meet their basic wash needs. The fourth, guarantee the continuity, affordability, and safety of water and sanitation services. And the fifth one and the last one, provide technical and financial support to utilities. Those are very different policies, and some of them have been widely promoted, such as the promotion of hand washing with soap, and others have made a significant impact, such as governments and regulators that prohibit utilities from disconnecting households that cannot pay the tariffs, or even reconnect households that were disconnected in the past due to lack of payment. However, other measures have been, let's say, less popular, or not always accompanied with the needed follow-up actions or resources. For instance, many governments announce measures to financially support utilities with their cash flows. But broadly speaking, those funds from governments or external support agencies have reached big urban utilities in some cases, but hardly reach smaller systems such as those in rural areas or in small towns. I think I will stop here and pass the floor back to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Jorge. It's very interesting to have so much information on these countries on WASH policies. We know that these policies were developed to meet urgent public health needs. Styrene Philippe is with USAID's Water for Africa through Leadership and Institutional Support Program, or WALIS. She has been talking with stakeholders in a handful of countries about their COVID-19 response policies. Styrene, I know your work is ongoing, but what are you hearing so far? Are the policies achieving what they set out to achieve?
Yeah, so what we are finding is that there's a mix of responses based on the countries where we are doing deep dives, but there's also a mix of responses based on the stakeholders within the same country. So sometimes there's consensus, but sometimes we've heard very different opinions on whether a certain policy or a measure or the overall COVID-19 response was effective. And I think it's important to acknowledge that quite often stakeholders haven't necessarily had the time to reflect deeply on what's working and what's not working, as they are still responding to second and third waves of COVID-19. And in some cases, they're responding to other emergencies. We're currently interviewing a variety of stakeholders from national government, local government, NGOs, donors, and the private sector. And most stakeholders agree that the information they are sharing with us is their opinion. It's what they experienced, it's what they saw. And this information has enormous value. And through this information, we are able to capture lessons learned. But many stakeholders don't have all the information or data to be able to answer this question on our policies achieving what they are set out to achieve. One of the key findings of our study is so far that there is a lack of data. Generally, I would say the WASH data collected during the pandemic provides a good insight on what happened and what is happening, but not necessarily on how effective the policies and measures were. So for example, we might know that 2,000 hand washing stations were built, but we may not know how many already existed, how many needed to be built, and are people using the hand washing stations as planned. So to go back to your question, are the policies achieving what they set out to achieve? I think at the moment, the answer to this question will often depend on the person you ask, their role, and their definition of what is effective. But I really believe that it will be easier for stakeholders to respond to this question once the pandemic is under control and we can do more in-depth evaluations.
Great. Thank you so much, Styrene, for providing this perspective on mixed results. At the end of the day, these policies often have the biggest impact on water and sanitation service providers. To understand how COVID-19 response policies impacted service providers, we are now joined by Yoram Sinyangwe, the Managing Director of Lupanga Water Supply and Sewage Company in Zambia. Yoram, we know that the Zambian government implemented a wide range of policies in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. How these policies impact your utility?
So thank you very much, and greetings from Zambia. Zambia recorded its first case on March 18th, 2020, rather 2019. And in response to the scourge that was happening in most countries, our government set up a number of measures which had a direct impact on water supply and sanitation service provision. There were no policies as per se, but statutory instruments and guidelines across various sectors were issued. Arising from those, actually, some of the measures put in place in the water sector included the following. One, there was a closure of schools and elementary, from elementary to university. And as such as these utilities contribute, especially to our customer base, we saw that our income reduced drastically in terms of sales. In a similar manner, as schools, some entertainment places and food industries were also closed and only allowed to operate on a takeaway basis. This also affected our revenue and income at large. The biggest impact, however, was actually influenced when our CEOs were asked by our government to suspend withdrawal of service from defaulting customers. Consequently, our customers who are used to always being threatened before they could come forth to pay bills just stopped coming to pay their water bills. And we saw that our income dropped to even below 50% in some months. In certain cases and units, we actually had even reduced labor as we had to operate on a work rotation basis. There was also reduced and delayed support from cooperating partners and stakeholders on very important programs which affected our contribution to Vision 2020. As such, we could not do certain programs such as extension of programs. And as you may be aware, here in Zambia, we don't have 100% water coverage. And we've been moving towards this program to try and see that we can have 100% water coverage. Water utilities operators actually are typically funded by our customer payments. That is after we bill. And with reduced economic activities in our area of operation, which is highly dependent on the informal sector or small business owners, income for Lupanga Water also drastically reduced. Now, even if the ban was lifted a year later in April 2021, most customers had bills swelled up, and this has led to difficulties in doing business with them. The utility was not only affected with reduced revenue, but equally reduced manpower as well. This was also amplified due to lack of enough space, which forced us to rotate the workforce. By and by, some of our staff actually contracted the virus and had to stay away from the offices. Other than that, about 5% of our employees also lost parents or a close relative, which affected their psychological being and output at work. Maybe at this time, I'll pass it on to you, Isabel, to carry on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Yoram, for sharing these insights on the impact and difficulties that service providers face in Zambia. So we are hearing that these policies and the degree to which they are implemented have significant impacts on essential water and sanitation services. Jorge, what is UNICEF's learning about how well COVID-19 response policies have been implemented? You are on mute, sorry, Jorge.
Sorry. Yes, this is my opinion, and of course others might have completely different opinions, or country experiences might be different. But overall, I believe that the worst scenarios for the water sector haven't occurred. During the early days of the pandemic, many alerted of the significant drop of revenues by utilities across the world, and many anticipated service providers being unable to continue providing water and sanitation services due to financial defaults or breaks in supply chains. It might have happened in some cases and during short periods of time, but UNICEF keeps monitoring basic social services in over 120 countries. And in the latest assessment earlier this year, it seems that in most countries, services are in general terms delivering as before the pandemic. Together with SIWI, we are releasing a new study on the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19 to the water sector, which highlights both positive and negative impacts of the pandemic. You can find, by the way, you can find the report in Pathable next to the chat box under files. Just a short commercial. On one side, we identified lower levels of water and sanitation services in many contexts. And we have to acknowledge that some countries are currently facing the worst waves of COVID cases due to the Delta variant. The second point is related to threatened financial sustainability. As I said earlier, the worst scenarios of massive collapse in utilities in both developing and developed countries did not happen, or at least not in a large scale. But we should not disregard the fact that their accounts have been affected in many cases. And this puts at risk planned investments to conduct maintenance of infrastructures or to future investments in renovations or expansions. This is particularly worrying in a moment of global economic crisis, including donor countries, which might have a negative impact in ODA flows and reduce financial support to the wash sector in the mid-long term. However, the picture is not all negative. During the pandemic, we have been able to identify some promising trends. Some of them include enhanced communication and coordination. In many countries, stakeholders that hardly communicate or coordinate had, in some cases for the first time, worked together. Some of those experiences of collaboration shall contribute to establish better coordination mechanisms for future pandemics or crises. We also have been able to identify increased innovation and improve efficiency. One example is the use of mobile banking for paying water tariffs instead of collecting fees house by house. Other innovations are likely to continue beyond the pandemic. WASH is a key basic service and a human right. And I presume that everybody in this forum agrees with this, but not in all forums. And this crisis has helped positioning better our sector within the national priorities. Some WASH components that have received limited support, such as promoting hand washing with soap in the past, are now in many countries' agendas with fresh funding and new alliances. There is also a good momentum for promoting the progressive realization of human rights to water and sanitation and ensuring that no matter what or why, everyone has access to water and sanitation services. There is also growing pressure to keep those new policies that prevent utilities from disconnecting users that are unable to pay, which could have a long-term and very positive impact beyond COVID pandemic. And last but not least, this pandemic has been a shake-up call for all of us. Many countries are speaking about a green recovery, and the wash sector is also at the center of another crisis, the climate crisis. The green recovery is an opportunity for the wash sector to build back better and more resilient for future pandemics, but also for climate risks. If we are able to learn from this experience and to put the emphasis in making our sector more resilient, we will be more prepared for the next pandemic, and we will be able to cope with the negative impacts of climate change. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Jorge, again. And it's very interesting to see that there are or have been secondary positive as well as negative effects arising from the pandemic. As COVID-19 has shown us, developing and implementing policy is often extremely complicated, especially in the face of urgent shocks. Engineer Kasengwa Hara is the Executive Secretary for the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association, or ESAWAS. He works with regulators and policymakers throughout the region. Engineer Hara, has the pandemic changed the way regulators are thinking about responding to other shocks, like those related to climate change?
Thank you very much, Isabel, and very warm welcome to everybody joining us on this webinar. So yes, indeed, the pandemic really did expose us in terms of the inadequacies the water sector had, from inadequacies in service delivery to inadequacies in how to respond to an emergency, as the case were. As regulators, we've always demanded of the utilities to have in place emergency procedures, but these have been centered mostly on pollution or contamination control. But now we are thinking more broadly. Firstly, we are broadening the same emergency response plans to take into account other shocks, such as the COVID and any other shock that we might be impacted with in the future. And going forward, as regulators, we're developing a suite of guidelines, and these guidelines are centered at things like broadening the water safety plans, having a catchment focus, because when you talk about climate change, much as the utilities are there to supply water and provide sanitation services, the climate impacts will actually affect them from the catchment point of view. So they have to work hand in hand with organizations or institutions that are mandated also for catchment management. So that's one aspect. We're also putting in guidelines to deal with extreme event management in the cases of either be it drought or floods, as the case could be with climate change. Most importantly, we have developed what we're calling climate risk guidelines. Now, these are intended to help utilities in project management, project implementation, but more importantly, that they're used at the point of conceptualizing a project and screening through the potential risks that any particular water sanitation project might be affected with in the future. But as I said, I think this is a broader suite of guidelines to take into account much more shocks, and also focusing on the climate risks that we could be impacted with going forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Engineer Hara, for showing us how the pandemic can actually prepare us for the future climate shocks. Serene, as the climate crisis increases the frequency and severity of this type of shocks, what support are you finding that policymakers need to be able to make and implement more effective policies?
So going back to my previous point, there is a need for more data to inform policies, and not just data on access to wash services for households and schools and healthcare centers, but also data on human resources, finances, equipment and materials, things like that. There's a lot of work to be done on improving data quality, but also the dissemination of data through data management systems. We heard various stakeholders struggling to find the data necessary to determine the immediate needs in the areas where there were outbreaks. Other support that was identified by stakeholders to improve wash responses for future emergencies included the need for a strong coordination mechanism to ensure coordination between the ministry or the department that's in charge of WASH and the other ministries involved in the emergency response. So particularly with COVID-19, we looked into the coordination between the WASH sector and the Ministry of Health. In terms of finances, a challenge that was mentioned was accessing funds fast enough to respond to COVID-19. And one solution that was mentioned by a few stakeholders was the need for an emergency fund that's ready to go as soon as an emergency is declared. And in terms of capacity development, there were mentions of the need to develop the capacity of government officials, donors, and the WASH sector as a whole on best practices for emergency responses. As you mentioned, the climate crisis will increase the frequency and severity of emergencies, and more of us are going to have to work in emergency settings. And it's important that we all learn from those that have experience responding to emergencies. We're not starting from scratch. So to summarize, some key ways to support decision-making and the implementation of policies include improving monitoring, ensuring a strong coordination mechanism, the creation of an emergency fund, and improved capacity of emergency responses for all stakeholders in the WASH sector.
Great, thank you so much, Serene, for showing us the importance of and the need of that data quality and dissemination to inform policies, also better coordination and capacity building. Yoram, what types of government and regulator policies would help Lupanga Water be more prepared for the next climate shocks?
Okay, so thank you very much, Isabel. At the moment, Zambia, through various departments or ministries, has a number of policies and other guidelines which are useful. I can mention a few, such as the Parliamentary Water Supply and Sanitation Act, number 28 of 1997. There's another one, which is the Water Resources Management Act, number 21 of 2011. And there are also policies included in the National Water Supply and Sanitation Policy of 2020, as well as the National Policy on Climate Change of 2016 rather. Now, as mentioned earlier, we really saw a very big struggle for the water sector, and CUs such as Lupanga Water Supply and Sanitation Company, our company, really struggled to mobilize resources, especially for operation. And as such, I think it would really be very helpful if at all we had deliberate policies that will give relief to such institutions, especially during pandemic, as we have been going through. Even if we had institutions such as USAID come through Wallis to come and support us by doing the financial stress analysis and business continuity plan. Also, we had UNICEF and SNV come through. We still really need more like I mentioned earlier, you see a lot of programs were put on hold, maintenance programs were put on hold, which has seen quite a lot of dilapidation in our infrastructure and equipment. And therefore, such policies, deliberate policies, especially to support such sectors, we really saw quite a lot come through other sectors such as health, where we saw deliberately that the health received quite a lot of support, but that was not really the case with water utility companies. And just taking advantage, Isabel, of this platform, I would really like to use this opportunity to even lobby for this support, as these institutions such as mine are really going through a lot hard time to recover. Remember, I was mentioning that our customers at the moment are finding it even very difficult to do business with us. It implies that they have accumulated huge bills, and they're really finding it very difficult to really zero in the bills and just do business as they were doing in the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yoram. Indeed, support is still needed in the sector to alleviate the struggle to immobilize these resources. Engineer Hara, as we saw with COVID-19 and we will see with climate shocks, regulators are in a tough position of balancing the interests of the public with the needs of the service providers, who must stay financially solvent to be able to serve the public. What guidance can SWAS share with their partners on how to strike this balance in the future, both while building resilience and responding to shocks?
Once again, thank you very much, Isabel, for that question. So one thing we learned out of the pandemic, much as it's ongoing, is that we had to work through a multi-stakeholder approach. As you heard from the other participants, and in most countries across our region, the initiative to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic was led by the Ministries of Health. But the Ministry of Health did co-opt regulators and other agencies to try and help them. Are you aware? Water has been a frontline measure in the fight against COVID. So we advocate always, and in this moment, I think it's important to strengthen these multi-stakeholder approaches. I could give an example of one initiative in the region that's going very well, and this is the Lusaka Water Security Initiative. And it did manage to cushion Lusaka Water in particular, that's a utility in Lusaka in Zambia, through this multi-stakeholder approach where various stakeholders came in and did support the utility, did support interventions to deal with the COVID. And I think that was a lesser, much needed support and lessen the burden on the part of the utility. So such kind of interventions that we now demand of and encourage that all the regulators, all the countries, I think, need to embark upon. Now, some of the tools that I mentioned also, such as the water safety planning, you know that those require collaborative efforts. I did mention that now we have to look at interventions from the catchment to the tap end, and there's a demand on the utilities that they do form inter-agents water safety planning teams. So this is essentially trying to reinforce the fact that we need to use collaborative approaches going forward. All the regulators across our region have the role of advising the government. So regulators now have to enhance this advisory role to ram home the message that the government and the stakeholders all involved in the water sector need to invest much more, because we were really exposed by the inadequacies, the fact that most of the countries don't cover 100% water and sanitation services. But for the regulators, we're also learning that we need to be flexible to help the utilities to remain solvent. I do know a number of regulators like Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia do demand of the utilities to ring-fence certain funds, such as sanitation surcharges that are intended for sanitation improvement. But in the middle of the crisis, the regulators had to be flexible and support utilities by freeing those resources, allowing the utilities to use those resources for operations as well. Another point I would mention is the fact that we need to innovate, and we have innovated as regulators and utilities at large. So things that have been mentioned like e-billing, the e-meter readings as well, reducing the interfaces with the customer, because obviously lessening the transmission possibilities. So these are some of the things that we are learning, and as regulators, we can encourage also other agencies to go into. At this moment, Isabel, I would end here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for these insights, Engineer Hara, and to bring the importance of strengthening multi-stakeholder approaches. So we will continue now with the Q&A session. I would like to remind you that we will take your questions on the Pathable chat in the website. So I see there are a few questions here already. We will start with the first one. So this question is for all of our panelists. As Vanessa mentioned, COVID-19 did not affect everyone equally, and marginalized populations were often the most impacted. What types of policies are needed to ensure that the most vulnerable communities are especially supported in the face of future climate shocks? I would like to start with Jorge, please. You're muted.
Again, sorry. It's like if we haven't learned anything in the last year and a half. As I said, this is a good question. Earlier this week, and I would like to also link with one of the questions from the participants on sustainability. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to participate in a session on the next generation of sustainability monitoring. And definitely sustainability and resilience has to be at the center of the recovery. This pandemic has been a shake-up call for all of us. Many countries are speaking about this green recovery, and if we are able to learn from this experience and put emphasis on making our sector more resilient, we should be able to be prepared for the next pandemic, as I said earlier. And we will be able to cope with the negative impacts of climate change as well as the next pandemic, because it's a matter of time before we will be facing another pandemic, unfortunately. So I want to believe that if we are able to systematize the experiences, if we are able to learn from the experience and be better prepared for the next crisis, something positive can come out from this pandemic. Over.
Thank you so much, Jorge. I'd like to pass on the same question to Styrene, please.
Yeah, so in terms of our study, I would say that one of the things that we found out was that some of the countries are lacking data on the vulnerability of population. And so if there was more data available, I think it could inform the policies and improve them. I know, for instance, in Madagascar, they didn't have enough data on the vulnerability of the population, especially in the capital. And so the council was scrambling to collect data while the pandemic was happening, which was a challenge because it was also under lockdown. So if that data already existed before these emergencies, I think it would improve the policies themselves, but also it will make it easier to implement the policies.
Great, thank you, Styrene. I would like to continue maybe with Yoram. What do you think about the vulnerable populations and their needs? How can we address them better?
Yes, please. So just like a previous speaker, indeed, I think the application of these policies should also be well directed if at all there is more improved data. You find a situation where, for instance, these policies are applied across the whole population. But it's obvious that whilst this pandemic may have a more effect on certain societies and communities, others may not face such. And therefore, I think water utility companies should have at least more information available to the policymakers to ensure that once they are implementing these policies, probably only certain communities are applied in terms of those policies being directed to. Also, having information on their fingertips, as well as communicated areas such as information on how much, for instance, losses are happening in the system, because over time we have seen that there's a lot of inaccuracy, for instance, in the computation of non-revenue water and the likes. It could also help policymakers try to really zero in and see what resources are required. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Yoram. I will pass on for the next question for Engineer Hara. So the next question says, we saw that many data collection efforts start in response to COVID-19. However, found that many service providers still didn't have the information needed to better inform policies. So what types of information are the most useful as policymakers develop policies in response to these shocks?
All right, thanks once again, Isabel, for the question. And I guess this is coming from the participants. So during the pandemic, we did focus a lot more on the health of the utilities. So we collected a lot of information to do with the economics, the revenue, the collections, the operation costs, and so on and so forth. But in the case of dealing with such shocks, there's also other important information related to the coverage, how adequately areas are serviced. You're talking about the vulnerable communities. And regulators across the region, most of them are actually in the process of disaggregating how we get the data. Of course, we have always had a proper focus. And if you look at countries like Kenya and Zambia, they've also been basket funds primarily directed at helping the vulnerable communities. But in this instance, it's much, much more important that we get really down to the grassroots and get the basic data. So you may have heard of what is happening in Kenya, for instance, where indicators have been developed. They're called KPI 10, and these have been developed together with the water and sanitation for the urban poor, OSAP. So it is basic data from grassroots, trying to understand who is vulnerable indeed, which communities who need to be supported, which communities who need to be subsidized in the tariff process, but also in the process of extension of services, in addition to the commercial financial data that I've mentioned to inform policy making. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I have one last question. We have 4 minutes left for this session on questions and answers. So for whoever who wants to answer this one, it says, WASH activities are now on the front burner. How can we ensure that WASH remains a priority for future climate shocks?
Let me start, Isabel. I think what's important is that all players in the water and sanitation sector, we should play and do more advocacy. Like I said earlier, when we really, once we have been going through this pandemic, we have seen that certain sectors have received more attention, okay? Now we're told that the COVID-19 can be fought, especially just by washing hands with clean water and soap. But then, like here in Zambia, I never really saw a direct support to water utility companies and other players in the water sector. So we should play, I think, more advocacy and ensure that we communicate to policymakers that whilst other sectors are important, the water sector is just as important. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Yoram. And maybe Jorge, do you have a few last remarks on this question? We have a couple of minutes more.
Yes, I mean, I think we are talking to the converted here. I mean, we are all in the WASH sector, and we all believe that we are at the center of the world. But I do believe that we are at the center of the world, as it was proven in this crisis. WASH is at the center, is a basic service without which life is just not possible on Earth, and is also at the center of another crisis, which is the climate crisis. So I want to believe that. As in the case of SARS, for instance, some countries that were affected by SARS in the past have been more prepared to respond to the COVID pandemic. I want to believe as well that we as a sector, we have learned a lot from this COVID crisis, from early monitoring systems that can be put in place by analyzing traces of viruses in wastewater, for instance, coordination mechanisms, policies, contingency plans, you name it. I want to believe that all this kind of experience, all these systems that we have been able to put in place are contributing to make us more resilient for the next pandemic, but also more resilient for climate change. And I see a lot of commonalities between responding to the COVID pandemic and responding to the climate crisis that we are in. So I'm quite positive that positive in a way that the sector is better prepared for future crises, but unfortunately, my sense is that WASH will continue to be at the center of upcoming public health crisis or the climate crisis that I mentioned earlier.
Great, thank you so
Isabel,
much.
perhaps I could add a word as well to that.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, we always say in our region that water is at the center of economic development, but I think its position was even more heightened by the COVID. The fact that washing hands, for instance, was and is the front line, the very first measure to combating COVID. So, and then when you look at climate change, again, we're talking about water, energy being intertwined. So the WASH sector, my opinion, will continue to remain the center of attention for a very long time. And as stakeholders, we simply have to ensure that we keep driving home the message, the fact that we need a little more investment to ensure that everybody is adequately serviced and that we're in a position to combat any future shocks, be it related to COVID or even the climate risks. I think that for the foreseeable future, the WASH sector really remains a centerpiece for economic development and society well-being.
Perfect. Thank you so much for these last words of positivity for our sector. And thanks again to our speakers for taking the time to join us today and for your incredible work to support WASH services in the face of a global pandemic. Thank you also to USAID for organizing this discussion and creating this opportunity to learn from each other. Before we wrap up today's session, we invite you to complete our short poll. This is located in the Pathable page in the same box where you can find the chat. Select the poll tab at the top of the box and answer the question: did you learn something in today's session that you can apply in your work? As we heard today, when shocks occur, they pose a range of complex challenges. Economic effects mean many people can't pay their water and sanitation bills. As a result, water and sanitation service providers face rapidly decreasing revenue while still needing to provide essential services. Regulators are put in a difficult position of balancing the interest of the public by mandating free water, for example, with the needs of the service providers. We also heard loud and clear that these types of shocks and challenges will not end when the current pandemic does, but will intensify in the future as a result of the climate crisis. While we have heard a range of specific opportunities to prepare for the climate crisis we are already facing, such as ensuring government pays their water bills, setting up emergency operation plans, or conducting emergency scenario planning, one lesson that's overwhelmingly clear: now is the time to prepare for the next shock. We know it will come soon and be followed by others. Supporting investments in climate resilience now, before the next crisis strikes, is foundational in making sure that service providers can continue to provide essential services we rely on them for, no matter what the future holds. If you're interested in learning more about USAID's work on building resilience for WASH, we invite you to visit globalwaters.org. I would like to thank all people that have attended this session, and thank you for joining today. We wish you to enjoy the rest of the sessions of the World Water Week.